The text before the lesson is Genesis 1, verses 26 through 31. Genesis 1, 26 through 31. These are God's words. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. May God bless the reading and preaching of his word. Amen. Please be seated. Today we return to our series of lessons on the opening chapters of Genesis that are entitled The Beginning. This series, if you remember, is part of a larger project aimed at presenting the meta-narrative of the Bible, the complete series being titled The Beginning, the Middle, and the End. In Revelation 21, speaking of the end, in Revelation 21, the Apostle John recounts a vision that he had of the new heavens and the new earth coming out of heaven as a holy city, the New Jerusalem. And the angelic interpretation of that revelation, which comes a few verses later in verses 22 through 27, is that in the eschaton, in the end times, God's presence will no longer be restricted to one set of coordinates on the planet. It will no longer be restricted to one city, but rather the whole earth will become his dwelling place, his new Jerusalem, his temple. And as we noted last time, this was God's intention all along. And it's why the opening chapters of Genesis contain so much temple imagery. For they depict the earth's formation as God building a tabernacle. And of course, the final step of temple construction, or at least this was the case in the ancient Near East, was to place an image of the god or gods inside the temple. And that's exactly what we find in our text this afternoon. Man, who is created in God's image, as it says, is placed in his temple in order to reflect God's glory in the world. Now, in order to better understand this very important symbol of image bearer, we need to place it in its cultural context and also its geographical context, as we might say. By geography there, I'm referring to what we find in Scripture itself, the sort of layout of the earth that we are given. So we'll first look at that geography and see what it reveals to us about this image that we bear, that Adam is to bear and Eve. But then second, we'll come back to the cultural context and see what that has to add to it as well. So we begin with the geography. When we zoom in on creation in Genesis chapter 2, which is essentially what Genesis chapter 2 does, chapter 1 recounts creation for us, sort of the big picture, and then Genesis 2 tells some of the story again, but with a tighter focus. When we zoom in chapter 2, one of the things that we find is that the earth has been laid out as a model of the temple complex, meaning that it contains, just as the later temples did, 3 distinct regions: an inner sanctuary, what later would be called the Holy of Holies, And then outside of that, the holy place, as it was called. And then finally, the outer courts. Now, in the original creation, Eden was to serve as the sanctuary. It was the place where Adam, the high priest, as it were, would experience the unique presence of God, where he would walk with his Creator in the cool of the day. Now, just as some evidence toward that interpretation, the Hebrew verbal form that's used for God walking in the garden also describes God's presence in the sanctuary of the tabernacle. So the way the words are used, it's meant to point to the idea of God's presence in the tabernacle. And this is why, by the way, Eden is located high on a mountain. Because throughout Scripture, God dwells in high places, right? Like on the top of Mount Sinai, or in Jerusalem, which is the city set on a hill. Now, as the epicenter of God's presence then, Eden was to serve as the fountainhead of all life and faithfulness. And this truth is symbolized by the rivers that flow out of Eden and bring nourishment to the rest of the earth. Rivers, of course, is a symbol for fertility and flourishing in Scripture. For example, in Psalm 1, very familiar psalm, no doubt, verses 3 through 4, says that the man who is blessed is like a tree who is planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. Now, that kind of fecundity, that kind of fruitfulness, is also often associated with the temple itself in the Old Testament, like in Psalm 36, which says this in verses 8 through 9, "They feast on the abundance of your house," that's the temple, "and you give them," this is very beautiful, "and you give them drink from the river of your delights." Literally, in the Hebrew there, it says the river of your Edens. Verse 9, "For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light." And so one of the great blessings of God's presence on earth and the ability to come into his presence is fruitfulness. This would be as opposed to the lack of presence of an idol, which then leads to fruitlessness. Now, the visions that are recorded concerning the eschatological temple, or the temple that will come in the end times, also speak of these rejuvenating rivers flowing out of the sanctuary. And you'll see how it's the language of Genesis 1 and 2, really Genesis 2 being repeated, rethought. It's sort of a return to these rivers. Like in Ezekiel 47, which says, "Then he brought me back to the door of the temple, and behold, water was issuing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar." This is a river, of course, that will continue to flow down and water the entire earth. Similarly, in the temple of Revelation 21, verses 1 and 2, there is portrayed a river of the water of life coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb. And this river also flows down into a garden-like grove. Now, last time we talked about the fact that God's throne is in the sanctuary of the temple, right? He sits, as it were, on the mercy seat, and it is from there that all of his provision, all of his blessings flow. And so Eden, in the original creation, was to serve as God's throne room, to be the Holy of Holies from which divine provision for the whole earth was to proceed. This then takes us to the second region of the earthly temple, which is the garden that adjoins Eden, which we also see reference in Revelation 21, the garden that is adjacent to the holy city. And here we have what appears to be a mixing of metaphors in Genesis, which is not that unusual. But this idea of the adjoining garden is a metaphor that relates to palaces. In the ancient Near East, it was palaces that typically had these kinds of gardens. Not just in the ancient Near East, this is something that's a tradition throughout many cultures over many vast epochs, spans of time. So it's really this, the picture is that of a palace with a garden that is attached to it, or gardens, plural. But these two metaphors of the temple and the palace work together nicely because, as we've said, the temple is God's abode. It's the place where the king dwells, seated on his throne, as we said, ruling the nations. And so the sanctuary of God then can be thought of as a palatial residence. It's a temple palace, we might say, which is fitting because soon we're going to be discussing the role of man as priestly king. And that role, of course, is something that, if you've been coming to the church for a while, is a subject that I talk about a lot. And so what's pictured here is a temple palace. Now, in the temple imagery, Eden then is the inner sanctuary, and the garden is the holy place. And the details of the story line up nicely with that kind of arrangement. For example, in the holy place of Israel's temple, there was the lampstand. In the Genesis 2 account, there is the tree of life. In Israel's temple, in the holy place, was the bread of presence that provided food for the priests. In Genesis 2 are the trees, which provide food for Adam, who is serving essentially as high priest. And on we could go. So that's the second region, the second area that is depicted for us. The land and seas beyond the garden then would make up a third distinct region, and this would be equivalent to the outer court of Israel's subsequent temples. This is the area of consecration, or even beyond that to the more unsanctified places like the court of the Gentiles. So let me now summarize those three areas for you, because it lays the groundwork for then talking about man being this image bearer. And really, I borrow this summary from G.K. Beale, who's a scholar. He's written a lot on this subject, and I'm going to be borrowing from him significantly, at least for the next couple of lessons. But he summarizes these three regions this way: that in Eden, that is where God dwells as the source of both physical and spiritual life, and that, of course, is symbolized by the descending waters. The garden, then, is where God's priestly servants worship their Creator by obeying his mandate of cultivating and guarding the holy place. And then the outermost region that surrounds the inner courts is the place that Adam is to consecrate to God, fulfilling his priestly service. Which is to say that Adam, with Eve as his helpmate, was commissioned to both guard the sanctuary from unclean animals and to consecrate the outer courts. It's what is said in Genesis 2:15, which was read to us, where the command to Adam is to work and to keep, to guard and to consecrate all that, essentially the entire earth. And so the goal then is to extend the geographical boundaries of the temple until it reaches the four corners of the earth. That is Adam's task, which means that God's presence in the sanctuary was meant to be cast abroad. The task is to extend the sacred space, you might say, to bring divine order to the inhospitable outer spaces. And so this is what the river imagery represents. It's a pouring out of God's rule and righteousness upon the world, or as the prophets would say, to cover the earth with the knowledge of his glory as the waters cover the sea. We could also think of this in agrarian terms, using that kind of imagery, which is to cultivate the earth. Man is a gardener. He's not a park ranger. He's not there to, put up a fence and say, don't step on the grass, right? He is a gardener. His job is to cultivate the earth. It's to bring out all of its potential, to turn the wild garden and all the rest of the earth into a thriving city, is the imagery. This is what we often refer to then as the cultural mandate or the creation mandate, that man is a sub-creator, as J.R.R. Tolkien once put it, that he is to participate in the creatio continua, the continuing or ongoing creation, that work that God begins and then man takes over. Or many today will often refer to it as the dominion mandate, man exercising his rule, his dominion over the earth. The point of all of it is that Adam was to start with the garden and work his way outward until all of the earth was brought to maturity, or we might say until all of the earth would become the Lord's temple. So that then brings us to our discussion concerning Adam and Eve as image bearers. The notion of the imago Dei is how it's often spoken of. That's in Latin. When it comes to theology, Latin is often the language that much of it was written in, and so you will hear people use Latin terminology. But the image of God, the imago Dei, what is this exactly? Well, we now go to some of the cultural context. In the ancient Near East, this kind of language was used, this idea of being an image bearer. And what it emphasized was not so much the form or the attributes of the person who is bearing the image, but his function. He was to serve as the place where the God manifested his presence and conveyed his blessing. And in the ancient Near East, it was kings who were said to play this role. In other words, it was a royal title that was given. The king was to reflect God's majesty and sovereignty in the world. And this would include the responsibility to subdue and to rule over the earth as God's vice regent, to be his representative and the intermediary of his power and blessing. One indispensable theological foundational truth that is essential to modern moral theory is the innate dignity and worth of persons. Our entire legal system rests upon the belief, as it says in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. That statement is a statement of theology, right? It's a foundational statement concerning mankind and his worth. And it's a foundation that comes, of course, from the Christian doctrine of the imago Dei, of the image of God. But here's what I want you to notice about it. Notice how exalted a view the Bible has of man in his original creation. The dignity which is bestowed upon him. Man is not a slave created so that the demigods could have someone to boss around, as some of the other myths of that time had depicted. No, man is a monarch. He is ruler of the earth. He is high priest of the God Most High. And while he is fallen, it is royal blood that flows through his veins, which makes his disobedience all the more shameful. There is nothing more pathetic, more prodigal than the prince who has traded his birthright for a pauper's inheritance. Christians, I think, in large part, have forgotten this. They have forgotten that they are heirs to the throne, right? That they are part of a royal priesthood. Instead, they often act like they are a pauper, contenting themselves with sinful lusts, base pleasures, forgetting that they are a king, that they are made in God's image, that they are a prince. There's a commercial a number of years ago for a cruise line. It's a brilliant commercial, but it just showed people in these really sort of boring jobs, these tedious jobs. They just did the same thing every day, a low-level sort of job. And the person, when they're doing this and everything around them is dark and miserable and, sort of fluorescent lighting, and it just seems tedious and degrading and demoralizing. And they would look at the camera and they'd say, I know you wouldn't know this, but I'm actually a king. Or the woman would say, I'm actually a queen or a princess, right? This is not who I really am. It's a role that I'm playing, but in reality, I am a king. And then, of course, it would show them on their 2-week vacation they would take every year where they would be treated like a queen or a king on the cruise ship. As if to say, this is who you really are, not this thing that you spend the rest of the year in. It touches us, it affects us, it would pierce us in such a way because it's true. Right? Every one of us is a monarch. We are a prince. And even though we are fallen, as I said, royal blood flows through our veins. And as Christians, we have been redeemed. We have been returned to this role. We have taken the mantle upon ourselves again, and so we should act like it. We should act in a distinguished way. Sin, then, is unbecoming of a king or a queen. So Adam is a prince whom God commissions to rule his territories. But before he can rule the earth, we are told in verse 28, he has to subdue it. He must conquer the wild lands that lay east of Eden, a goal which could only be accomplished if he or his progeny were to leave the boundaries of the garden. So he must conquer the wild lands that lay east of Eden. And one way that Adam and his bride were to fulfill this dominion mandate was by being fruitful and multiplying, as it says in our text, by filling the earth with their children, their offspring. In other words, those who bore their image. Ancient Near Eastern kings would set up images of themselves in various parts of their lands, images that represented their sovereignty, their sovereign presence in a particular area. And this is in large part how God's presence was to be spread throughout the earth. Adam and Eve's children were to be part of the vanguard movement, as one writer put it, spreading out over the earth with the goal of filling it with divine glory. And so the sons of Adam then would reflect his glory and thereby the Creator's glory. And in this we start to see this more clearly, this idea of the two Adams, right? The first Adam, who was to play that role as sort of the federal head of the human race, and he, of course, disobeys and abdicates that responsibility, and so the human race then is essentially lost, is wandering around in futility until the second Adam comes and then restores them to their true vocation. Which means then that central to the fulfillment of the dominion mandate is fruitfulness, the bearing and rearing of children. Which is to say, if you want to thwart the efforts of Satan, if you want to help usher in the eschaton, then you should be bearing much fruit. Now, in our culture, of course, we have almost completely forgotten, and this is true in the church as well, we've almost completely forgotten the blessing that children are. We have forgotten their kingdom utility, their purpose. And the reason we have forgotten this is because we have forgotten our vocation. We don't know why we're here. We're just a pilgrim wandering around, waiting for the return of Jesus. And it's not for nothing that every culture prior to the modern one thought that a quiver full of arrows was the status symbol, rather than just one or two that can be shot off into the wilderness somewhere, freeing parents up for more trivial pursuits. The end of parenthood is not an empty nest, so you can play badminton or whatever. Or what is it? Pickleball? Pickleball. The goal was to have lots of children so that you could create a strong and productive household. For the household was to be the hub of all cultural productivity, not the individual. A household with an extended family ruled by a patriarch. Indeed, a household gathered around a feast with the patriarch sitting at the head of the table used to be the symbol of felicity. A foretaste of the Lamb's feast and the eschaton. And from these strong households would come the building of faithful churches and finally virtuous communities. This is why, by the way, Satan despises the family in particular, because it is the fountainhead of all fruitfulness. And so he works diligently to undermine its effectiveness, because his only hope is to delay his inevitable demise by stalling the coming of the kingdom in its fullness. And as of late, he has been incredibly successful in this effort, at least in the West, that is. One indication of this is that the fertility rate in the United States and in the West in general is in free fall. Demographically, a population's replacement rate is 2.1 children per couple, meaning that in order to maintain the current population, 2 parents must produce on average a little over 2 children. A significantly lower rate means that the culture is in a death spiral. The current birth rate in the United States is 1.62. This is the lowest that it's been in over a century. And just to give a sense of the speed of this decline, there's the chart. Right, 1965, in 65, the fertility rate was just under 3. And if we go back before that, it's 4 and then 5. But now it is already down to 1.62. Such unfruitfulness is also happening in Europe. Norway and Germany have 1.5, Spain and Italy 1.3, and of course in Asia it's an absolute disaster. South Korea has 1. Taiwan, 1.1. In contrast, Muslim-dominated countries, both in Africa and the Middle East, are at 4, 5, and even 6. The point is that fertility is one of the most effective instruments of dominion. Just think of the threat the Jews posed to the Egyptians simply because of their high birth rate. Meanwhile, the rise of secularism in the West is rendering us impotent. For even with this rapidly declining birth rate, we are still being warned of the threat of overpopulation. That propaganda reveals the significant difference between secular and Christian views of anthropology, or our understanding of man and his essential nature. In the minds of secularists, as Doug Wilson has pointed out, people are essentially consumers. And when there are too many consumers, well, then our resources will become scarce. In contrast, the Bible looks at people as the opposite of consumers. It looks at them as producers. Therefore, in the biblical view, population problems come when there are not enough workers to feed all the people, and that's where we are headed. All of this to say that having children is not merely a personal matter. It has political consequences, kingdom consequences. If we continue at this rate of fertility, we will soon experience significant poverty and even perhaps enslavement. And the judgment of God will rightly be upon us, for we have abandoned our mandate to exercise dominion by being fruitful and multiplying. And this is, of course, just one part of Satan's war on fruitfulness. We could talk about abortion. Over 60 million workers, right, image bearers, have been torn to pieces in the United States alone. or the infecundity of sexual perversion like homosexuality, which the Apostle Paul uses as the metaphor to describe idolatry, this union that is absolutely fruitless, the barrenness of idolatry is shown in the union of two men or two women, and on we could go. The last thing to say about these passages is that carrying out the dominion mandate of Genesis 1:28 was to include defeating and ruling over the serpent. Like Israel's later priests, Adam was to prevent unclean things from entering the temple precincts. In fact, the priests were instructed that if some man that was unclean, a Gentile or something, tried to run through the gates, they were to put him to death. But God's image bearer, of course, failed in this duty by allowing the unclean serpent to enter and defile the holy place. In doing so, he lost his position, his title, his vocation, and he was replaced by two cherubim who took over the responsibility of guarding the garden temple. And along with this loss of vocation comes a cursing of his productivity, a rendering of all future efforts vain. A fall from grace that we will discuss in greater detail in a future lesson.